Hello and welcome to the National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. This podcast is brought to you through the generous support of the Albert and Ethel Hertzstein Charitable Foundation. Each week, our in-house experts sit down with special guests to discuss depictions of World War II on film. Sit back and get ready for a lively debate that will reveal the good and bad of how Hollywood shows the 20th century's most dramatic event. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and our special guests for today's episode are Dr. Jason Dawsey, research historian.
Thanks for having me.
Gemma Birnbaum, Associate Vice President of the World War II Media and Education Center.
Hi, happy to be here.
At the museum. And Sara Abosch-Jacobson, Chief Education Programs and Exhibitions Officer at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum.
Very pleased to be here.
Today we will be discussing the 2002 film, The Pianist. The Pianist is a biographical film based on the experiences of the Polish-Jewish pianist and composer Wladyslaw Szpilman. The film begins with the German and Soviet invasion of Poland in September 1939 and follows through the remainder of the war, focusing on Szpilman's struggle for survival after he is separated from his family and put in the Warsaw Ghetto. Szpilman participates in the Warsaw Uprising, goes into hiding, and is eventually discovered by a German officer who helps the talented piano player survive the rest of the war. The Pianist stars Adrien Brody as Szpilman, Thomas Kretschmann as Wilhelm Hosenfeld, and Maureen Lipman. The film was directed by Roman Polanski, produced by Polanski, Robert Ben Moussa, and Alain Sard. It is based on the book by the same name, written by Szpilman. The film was widely praised and was a financial success. Adrien Brody received the Academy Award for Best Actor for his role. As we always do, and Jason, I'll start with you because you're our veteran here on this panel. How accurate do you feel this movie is?
I think it's really accurate. There's an attempt by Polanski to really put Szpilman's book into cinematic form, and so what we get is a kind of history of the Second World War in Warsaw, in the film. And I think in that sense, it really shows, especially for an American audience that doesn't know a great deal about Poland and World War II, you get not a great deal about the initial German invasion, but you do get a little on that. And then you get the steps that happen with ghettoization, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the August 1944 Uprising. And so, yes, you do get a real history in the film.
I think that you get the basic historical narrative, no question about it, but the failure that it has, and it may be just a failure of the method of film, is that like many of these kinds of histories, you don't get any sense of the Jewishness of the characters, what motivates them or doesn't motivate them on the basis of their religion and their culture. It's really pretty absent from that, and that's always very kind of puzzling to me because it is a large part of who these people were, and frankly, why they were ghettoized in the first place is because of their Jewishness, and there's no real overarching sense of that in the film, I think.
What about you, Gemma?
Well, I think the entire story is so not typical of what the Holocaust experience would be. So it may be accurate to Szpilman's experience and the book, but it's not necessarily what I would call an accurate depiction of surviving the Holocaust or the Holocaust in general, because you're already dealing with a story where most people did not survive. And so even the very fact that he survives it makes it atypical from everybody else's story.
Well, you talked, Jason, you brought it up, the ghettoization, and so did you, obviously, Sara. But how well do you think The Pianist conveys the experience of being in a ghetto or being placed in a ghetto, and then, especially this particular ghetto, the Warsaw Ghetto? How accurate do you think this is?
Well, I think both Gemma and Sara have already brought up the fact that anytime you're dealing with someone who survives, in this case, the Warsaw Ghetto, you're already dealing with something that's not really, it may be accurate in terms of the history, but it's also not representative, in that you're getting someone who lived through it and his circumstances were pretty extraordinary. But I think it does convey a lot about what ghettoization looked like, the fact that people, not so much the Szpilman family, but other people have to move into an area that is so small, they're just packed in there. And then the film really shows you the horrors of ghettoization. So it's an interesting, it may not be representative in two ways. It's not the fact that he survives, and this is a survivor story that's not about a death camp. It's really about what it was like to live in the ghetto, or in later parts of the film when he's able to operate in hiding outside of it. But in that sense, yeah, it really does show you what it's like: starvation, disease, the fact that you have Jewish authorities that are told by the Nazis you have to select so many people for deportation. You see all of those things, and how Szpilman has to figure out how to elude this, how to survive it.
There's also a lot of resistance that occurs in the ghetto. Not kind of the classic resistance of the uprising, Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which you see later in the movie, but what you don't get a sense is 80,000 plus people starved to death over the 3 years that they're in the ghetto. But in the process of that, you also have this incredible flowering of Yiddish literature and newspapers and theater and plays, and people are having prayer quora. There's hundreds of them throughout the ghetto, even though prayer is forbidden. There's schools, there's orphanages. I mean, there's just, as people are starving to death, they're doing amazing, amazing kind of acts of resistance because they're continuing to live their lives too. And again, it's a movie, so it can't do all of these things, but I would hope, that people who watch the film realize that life, even in this horrible place, was pretty rich for a lot of people before they, were deported and murdered.
Yeah, and I think the movie also does a really good job of showing the progression from disbelief to reality, because there's so many times when the family is saying, we don't have to go, and we're not going to go anywhere, and we're just going to go home, and it's going to be normal, and it's going to be fine. And I think some of that is a survival tactic, and some of it is because it's not that it was unprecedented. There's obviously pogroms and other things that happen to Jewish people, but the scale and the magnitude is something that had never really happened before. And so it also shows this really intense coming to grips with what is actually happening, and that this is the reality that they're about to face. So they're living their lives largely because they don't know any other way. They don't know that they're supposed to not be going on and doing the things that they do every day, which is, I think that was depicted really well.
And then too, by doing those things, it's an act of, as you said, defiance, if you will. But it's also, they're keeping their sanity. Mm-hmm. They're living their lives, their everyday lives, as best they can in this really, really crappy situation, and they're doing the best they can, and they're falling back on what they know. And then, if you've ever been in any kind of stressful situation, that's what you're going to do. You're going to resort to what makes you comfortable or what you know, and that's what they're doing here. And I think that's really cool too, is that, the movie shows that, and shows that pretty well. And that this is not the only Holocaust movie to do that, but I think it does it more so than say Schindler's List does, for sure.
Yeah. There's also kind of there's almost a frenetic level to the activity in the ghetto, to the cultural activity, the political activity. They don't show any of the political activity, but Warsaw is the largest single Jewish population in Europe at this time. It's
360.
Roughly, yeah. It's 30% of Warsaw's population. It's a big Jewish population, and they cram them into this horrible little area of the city, like under 2% of the city's area. They cram 30% of the population. And they, as we said before, they go on with their lives, but there's also political activity. There are people who are Zionists who are keeping an eye toward, because this is going to end and we're going to head to Palestine. There are communists who are saying the Soviets are going to get here and we're going to, make common cause with that. There are revisionist Zionists who are saying, we're right-wingers and we're going to be right-wingers to the end. So there's, even in the midst of all this, there's all kinds of bickering and fighting amongst the political groups. It's really, really interesting because you just don't think of it. You just think, oh my gosh, people are dying, they're starving, that's it. And their lives continue to be rich. It's frenetic. I don't know how else to say that about kind of the pace of it. It's like they're cramming as much living as they can into the time that they have.
I would agree with it that it is definitely frenetic, and that they do cram a lot in there. And I think that's also the filmmaker too. I think he's trying to cram every little bit that he can into this. Definitely. I don't think it was quite that active, in that short amount of time is what you said.
It's interesting too about what Sara mentioned about the lack of attention to the politics in the book. That's also largely true. There's not much in Szpilman's memoir about the politics. He mentions and this figure is briefly shown in the movie, a socialist who was printing newspapers, and he had this real sense of optimism. We're going to defeat the Nazis. We're going to beat them. And Szpilman in the book says, I was always very skeptical of this guy's optimism, but it turned out he was right. We did beat them. But other than that, there's not much of that in the book as well as in the movie, and that itself is I think revealing about Polanski. Why don't we see a little bit of that? But the book doesn't have a great deal of it either.
Well, we all kind of talked about this briefly in the opening, but how typical would you say his experience is? I mean, I already know the answer to this, and we already know the answer to this, but let's talk about it anyway because that's what we're going to talk about. So, Jim, I'm going to look at you. What's your opinion on that?
I mean, he meets a lot of righteous people. He meets a lot of people willing to help him that I don't think is typical of any Jew's experience during the Holocaust. I mean, he gets so many close calls and is lucky so many times simply by the kindness of this SS officer or this Polish citizen. And if it was really that many people who were willing to help that you were running into and meeting, more people would have lived. And so I think there are definitely depictions where he's getting, the woman running down the stairs like, Jew, Jew, and he's getting chased out of his hiding spot. But that's trounced in terms of the number of people who are actually willing to help him. And so I think, from that perspective, it's not that it would never happen. It did happen to him, but he definitely, it's out of his control. It's luck, which I don't think a lot of people had that luck, obviously.
What about you, Sarah? What do you think?
I absolutely agree with Jim. I think his experience is an exceptional experience, and I think that Polanski and Szpilman on some level are kind of brethren that way because Polanski also is hidden, and he had some pretty close calls during his time in hiding, but Polanski survives and his parents survive too, and I mean that's pretty exceptional. It's not unheard of, but pretty exceptional. So the whole concept, people focus today upon the upstander in history. And unfortunately, as Gemma says, there weren't that many because if there had been more people would have been saved. And the Nazis, you get a sense of the randomness of the brutality in here, but you don't get a sense of the consistency of the brutality in this. And they were ghastly. I mean, there's no other way to say that.
I mean, I think where the film is, I think the Szpilman story is representative is not so much what happens to him as to his family.
Yeah.
His parents, his siblings are all deported, as far as we know. They end up to Treblinka and murdered there. And so in that sense, his family's story is much more representative of what happened to Warsaw's Jewish community.
Yeah. that
they did not make it. They were not lucky. There were no, as Sarah termed it, upstanders who intervened in their case. And so I think they're murdered in 1942. I think it's quite early.
They're in the Great Deportation between July and September of 42, and that is much more typical of the Jewish experience in Poland and the East, unless we're talking about the Holocaust by bullets. And what's particularly interesting about it is that I think as Americans we have this notion of Auschwitz and people survive Auschwitz, and it's not the death camp; they survive the concentration camp. But Treblinka and Sobibor and Chelmno and Majdanek doesn't have the same level of murder. Belzec, these are the quintessential experiences where you hit that camp and within 24 hours you're dead. It's not survivable. Yeah.
Well, one of the big parts of this movie is the build up to and then the execution of the Warsaw Uprising, and this is a big thing. And this is something that, again, unless I'm wrong here, is not really covered in too many Western films. I don't know. Maybe there's Polish or Soviet films that cover it. I don't know. But in films you see in the United States, this is not something that you see very often. What are your thoughts on the depiction of the Warsaw Uprising and how they build up to it? I think it's really cool how, and it's true, I mean, it's an accurate fact that he did not run guns, but smuggled weapons for the resistance fighters, and they show that in the film and everything else. So what do you guys think about that?
I think it was so subtle I almost missed it happening at first. I hadn't seen this movie since 2002 when it came out. And so watching it again, and not, deliberately not trying to do too much research beforehand. I wanted to watch it fresh and see sort of what I could pull out of it. And it took me a minute before I realized, oh my gosh, that's what he's doing. He's smuggling the weapons in. This is what's about to happen. The uprising is about to happen. And so I think it was done in a very sort of nuanced, subtle way that I almost didn't realize that's what he was doing, or what the others were doing in the ghetto. And so, I thought that was a really interesting way of doing it, because I don't think they necessarily all got together and said, we will do this uprising now. It was sort of these subtle acts of smuggling weapons and resistance to try to build to something bigger. And I don't think they necessarily knew exactly what they were building to either. And so being able to see it kind of over almost like a slow burn was really powerful, I thought.
I also like the fact that from his hiding place outside of the ghetto, he then sees both the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, so the Jewish uprising, beginning in April of 43, and then in August of 44, he's able to witness again, and he has a bird's eye seat, the Catholic uprising that follows. And it's just fascinating because he's kind of a voyeur on both of them, even though you get the sense that on some level he wants to be involved in both of them. And that's just incredible to see both of those in the same film, because you just don't see that.
Yeah, and the fact that it's one person's perspective. I know that some viewers may be frustrated, like, okay, I want to see more of the actual uprising or the combat with the Germans, but you get his vantage point of it, which is limited. So you kind of share in his limited perspective on that. Finding out what he can find out and helping where he could, and also, of course, seeing the fact that the Germans eventually crush it. And there's all the expectations. The Soviets are about to intervene. They're about to step in, and of course they don't. And so you see that in the film. It's interesting just to note here about the book that when Szpilman gets to 1944, he covers like the first 7 months of that year in about 2 pages. And then he's got multiple chapters just on the 1944 uprising. So obviously it mattered a lot to him when he put all that on paper.
I also thought there was some interesting parallelism in the film, because his parents are in the apartment in September of 39, and the bombing has started, and they're listening to the BBC, and they're really excited because the French and the British are in this, so this isn't going to last long. And then you hit the Warsaw Uprising, the Catholic Uprising of 44, and there's a sense in Warsaw the Soviets are right on the other side of the Vistula. They're going to come in, and they don't. And it's very interesting. There's kind of this notion that the great powers are going to help Poland and the Jews. And in both instances, it's to the extent that they do at all, it's way too late. So.
Well, they really didn't at all.
Well,
Let's be abundantly clear here. Yeah, they really didn't. And I mean, the whole thing. I like that part in the beginning of the film too, when they do, as you said, this isn't going to last long. That was a common thought in Poland in 1939. From really the entire citizenry, is that they figured that Germany's not going to last against these two huge Western powers of France and Britain, and how wrong they were. And I like the way that they show that. I like the fact that the movie, and granted, I mean, it is, I forget what the exact runtime on this thing is, but it's not exceptionally long. It's not too short. It's a pretty good length in terms of films, but it covers the whole war, which is, for better or worse, you are cramming a tremendous amount of material into one film. But it is cool because it shows the whole progression of the entire thing. I like the way that they show the uprising. I mean, I have to question, though. You got to question. I've done oral histories for years in this place, and, I've interviewed people, and I understand what they think they saw and what they saw. This guy was... He, as you said, Jimmy, he had extraordinary luck, number one. And number two, he always seemed to have the best seat in the house. So, there's always that question, in my mind anyway, of how much of it did he actually see and how much of it did he actually, participate in. But irregardless, I think the film does a very good job, and I do like the way they show it. We talked about resistance, and you brought up Sobibor, and I think this is a really interesting subject that we can talk about briefly if we'd like. There was the Sobibor uprising, of course, too. Sure. And this is in the camp. This is in the death camp. And that's something that there's only one movie. I forget. I think it's actually
Escape
called
from Sobibor. Yeah.
There you go. But that covers that. But that's a rather remarkable instance. Can you shed a little light on that for us?
Yeah, there was also one in Treblinka and one in Auschwitz. Those were the three. They are Sonderkommando, special Jews who are selected as the trains come into these camps. There are some Jews who are pulled off these trains, and they are used to push bodies into the gas chambers or they're less formal than gas chambers, some of them, but into the gassing areas, and then to pull them out and to get the bodies into pits. And that's all they do. And then they're murdered every few months. And at some point in 43, I believe it is, they realize, the current groups, that they're not going to survive, that they're going to be killed. And so they're the ones who rise up. And in fact, the only reason we know anything about Sobibor and Treblinka is because there were these uprisings, and a handful survived the war in its entirety. And we have their testimony, and that's how we know. I mean, the Nazis did their best to hide these places, to plow them under, put farming houses over them, and to say, nothing to see here. And we're just now, for Sobibor, I think, and for Treblinka as well, with ground-penetrating radar, Israeli German and Israeli Polish, I think an Israeli American academic projects are locating some of the areas that represented these camps. Some of the buildings, some of the places bodies were buried, everything like that.
As far as Sobibor is concerned, I think didn't it turn it into a forest?
Yeah,
the entire area. I mean,
and I think they put a farmhouse or some sort of a house on the place so they could say, there was nothing here.
It's worth pointing out too about the Sobibor uprising that was all the more remarkable since you had a group of inmates who had been in there for several months who did a lot of the lead planning, and then they win over a group of Soviet soldiers, POWs, who had been brought in, and it's a Soviet Jewish officer who handles a lot of them. They're all combat trained and had seen action against the Germans, and they know what to do when it comes to executing the plan against the SS. Yeah. They're ready to act, and it's their kind of cooperation that really makes that. Of course, anything like that requires a lot of luck, but also just the cooperation between people who knew the inside of the camp, the SS's routine, and the people who could take care of the combat side of it.
Well, Sobibor especially, too, because, as you said, they were combat officers, and if you look at the statistics and you look at the actions, or what we know, it's very evident that there were trained men doing that. It wasn't just some random person with a MG42. These were people who knew what they were doing, and they did, for all intents and purposes, considering the lineup, they did a pretty dang good job, really. Resistance occurs in many ways, in which we'll get to a little bit, something that we'll talk about in a minute. But what are other aspects of the resistance that we may or may not see in this particular film? What do you guys think about this? What can you talk on that?
Well, I mean, in the ghetto itself, as we briefly alluded to before, there's orphanages, there's soup kitchens, there's hospitals, there's schools. I know a Warsaw Ghetto survivor who was a child smuggler. There is smuggling. He's 91 years old now and can still recite in Latin the Cicero that he covered in his little clandestine school while he was in the ghetto. I mean, there were all of these kinds of things. And there's something else that I would point out. Early in the movie, the father, I think, takes the Americans to task because the Americans don't care. American Jews aren't doing anything. And that's just not true. The American Joint Distribution Committee, until I think it's 42, when the Nazis shut it down, are giving funds for soup kitchens, for an orphanage, for sustenance within the ghetto. And that's all American Jewish private money that's being donated on this end and then gotten in on that end. So they're not as isolated as I think a lot of people would think because there's a wall around that ghetto. There's much more porousness through that wall than I think we would think there is. So,
well, you brought it up. How common was that stereotype against American Jews?
I have no sense of that. I know that after the war, there's terrible American Jewish communal guilt. We didn't do enough. We didn't do anything. We were just worried about ourselves. We then kind of buried it under the rug and didn't commemorate it publicly. None of this is true. And there have been scholars who've written about this really in the 2000s is when the scholarship starts to come out. But I can't speak to what Polish Jewry would have thought about it. I'm sorry. I just don't know it.
And it's not even just the accusation, it's the way it's phrased, that there's these powerful Jewish bankers and they're not, why aren't they lobbying to the government? And it's like, a significant number of American Jews are living in poverty coming out of the Depression and through the war. I mean, they don't have the political power that I think the assumption that they might have, they just don't have it. And so, when you look at the actual ability that they have to help, it's very limited. So I think given how limited that experience was and how much information they weren't getting, I mean, unless you had a family member that you might have been able to get in contact with or something, a lot of the stuff is not being reported on. It's on the 10th page of the New York Times in a little corner. It's not on the front page. It's not being shown everywhere. And there's a lot of things that they just didn't know, especially if they didn't have a connection there. That was, I think, something where I couldn't tell if it was, Polanski's view of American Jewry at the time as a survivor himself, or if it was something that was, something that he had heard and he was projecting onto the characters, but wasn't necessarily something he would have thought himself, or if this was a common pervasive idea. But, I think about, Rabbi Stephen Weiss in Madison Square Garden, like trying to get other American Jews involved and informing them of what is going on. And, there's all of these things that result, and there is some push on the American government as a result of this. It doesn't go far enough, and they're not listened to enough. But I think it also doesn't take into account the amount of anti-Semitism that's also going on in the United States. This is not a powerful group. This is not a group that's going to be listened to and taken seriously, because they're also experiencing on a much different level anti-Semitism as well.
Yeah. Yeah, there's also that group of the largest group of American Orthodox Jewish rabbis who get down to Washington to lobby. So that's active. There's the Berkson group under Peter Berkson, who is a Jewish Palestinian, it's mandatory Palestine, who comes to the U.S. and his role is to raise money for the coming state, and instead he ends up being a real kind of rallier of the Jewish troops on behalf of the Jews in Europe, and he helps stage, Ben Hecht is part of this, they stage massive rallies and showcases in Madison Square Garden with tens of thousands of people who show up, and ads are taken out in the newspaper. I mean, there's a lot more, I think, than in retrospect people realize was going on at the time.
What I thought was insightful about those comments, though, in the film was that it showed this feeling of abandonment. I think that the Szpilman family, I think much people across the living in the ghetto, I'm sure, experienced. I mean, the fact that Britain and France do practically nothing after they declare war, and that the country is invaded, occupied, divided up. And then you get the process of ghettoization. So I could understand that they would feel like, what are American Jews doing for us? Look, Britain and France have already done nothing. And it's not really even highlighted in the book, but obviously, the Soviets occupy the eastern half of Poland. They're not obviously doing anything to counter Hitler. Yeah. They're working with him until the summer of 1941. And you think, well, who can we look to for help when that's the situation we're up against? And you think about Warsaw is under German occupation longer than any other capital in Europe except Prague. I mean, we can leave Austria out. That's a peculiar
case. Only they don't
case.
flatten Prague.
So
right. It's a little different.
They do not. And Prague does not experience the devastation at all that Warsaw encountered. And so you're living under German occupation for 5.5 years, and it's an especially brutal one. I mean, the city is, of course, hammered in September of 1939. There's then the Ghetto Uprising in April 1943, August of 1944. I mean, I think the Germans killed 250,000 people when they suppressed that uprising. I mean, it's savage. And then, of course, the fighting that takes place before the Red Army actually takes it, in January of 1945. So Warsaw really goes through an utter hell, really, in the Second World War that few other cities can even.
I guess the one other thing I would say about the American Jews not helping us comment is I think it's kind of a after the fact comment, and one of the reasons I think that is because the major Jewish population in Europe is Central and and Eastern European. And the American Jewish population is in no way, shape, or form before the end of the war a leading population in world Jewry. I mean, what's remarkable about it is that we emerge from the war, we, the Americans, emerge from the war, and we're kind of entering the Cold War, and we're the leaders. But American Jewry all of a sudden is like, wait, we're the biggest single Jewish population in the world. And that awareness just isn't there in 1939. We're Americans are isolationist pretty much across the board. I mean, it's a big factor for us. And there's just no sense, I think, amongst pre-war American Jewry of the uniqueness of their position, of the specialness of their position. As Gemma said, there's anti-Semitism, there's other things that have flared up. There's Father Coughlin, there's all kinds of discomforts that American Jews are going through, and no sense of what's going to become really their incredibly powerful and unique position. So I wonder if Polanski isn't kind of reading that backward into his story.
I was going to say, I think he is, because, I mean, as you said, Jason, I mean, this is Eastern Europe. This is not France. This is not Holland, where there are more American, or there are more immigrants in the United States from those countries than there are Poland. Obviously, there are Polish immigrants in the U.S., but there's a heck of a lot more coming from France and Germany and places where, Poland's the last place on earth in Europe that the United States is thinking about. And I would argue, too, that the United States is probably the last place on earth that Polish people are thinking about in September 1939, too, because of the fact that England and France they're the big powers, and the U.S. is, as you said, we're an isolationist country. We had nothing to do, or we wanted nothing to do. I mean, the vast majority of the country didn't want anything to do with anything going on in Europe. So I think the way that it is depicted in the film is Polanski's own view, not necessarily the view of the vast majority of Polish Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942 through through the end of the war. I don't think that's an accurate depiction of the situation, personally. All right, so let's move on. Let's talk about the depiction of the righteous citizens and the SS and the Wehrmacht, because Hosenfeld is actually, he's Army. He's here. He's not Waffen-SS or Allgemeine SS at all. But they do show SS in the film, obviously. Let's talk about the righteous citizens, of which there, as you said, Gemma, there's a plethora of them in this movie. Anybody?
Well, the one thing I would say, which it's probably not the most fair thing in the world to say, but I'm always amazed, because the largest single group of righteous among the nations is recognized by, the Israel Holocaust Memorial Authority, are Poles. But with 3.1 million Polish Jews or 3.2 million Polish Jews, it's a lot of opportunity to be righteous. But if you kind of spread that out over the course of the population, the record is still, it's pretty sparse.
The part that was really interesting to me, and that was probably the most upsetting, is that they have a choice. And that choice, while a dangerous one to help, doesn't necessarily stop them from living their lives the same way that, that Szpilman is not living his life. His life has not evolved or changed in the years that we see him depicted. It's the same thing. He's hiding in apartments. He's hiding in attics. And, in the meantime, this woman that had the potential to be his love, right, Dorota, has gotten married. She's having a baby. She's done the markers of adulthood and other things that he has not been able to do, that he should have done because he's the same age, and it's just on hold. And he's been on hold for years. And even though it's, she and her husband are helpful and they're helping him as much as they can before they also just leave. They flee. They got to do those things. And it's not that Jews are not getting married or having children during this time, but it's a heck of a lot more difficult, and it's a risk, and it's often done because sometimes they think they'll never get the chance to do it because they might die. And I think that's, and when he sees her and he sees this loss of potential of a relationship, and also there's this, there's this way Adrien Brody's face just kind of falls when she got to do these things that I wanted to potentially do with her, and she got to do them with somebody else because I've just been trying to live. I've just been trying to survive.
Yeah, I the one thing I would say, kind of in favor of the Poles and all of this, is that it is the East, and if they're caught helping Jews, they're killed.
It's true.
Or they're deported. to concentration camps. In the West, frequently you get off with a slap on the wrist. So the Nazis themselves, or the Germans, or you can, I suppose, for a lot of this you can use it somewhat interchangeably, treat the Poles and the Soviets very differently than they treat other peoples that they occupy. And it's hard to keep that in mind when we kind of go through this, and I think we sort of have to. But having said that, your comparison between the two different kind of trajectories of their lives, I think, is really important, because he doesn't get to do any of this. You're absolutely right.
I mean, you can see the way, you brought that up, the way the Germans treat their enemies in the East as opposed to their enemies in the West. You can see that in the military aspects of the war, too. I mean, not that there weren't a lot of atrocities on the Western Front. We've talked about this, Jason. There were, but there were far more against the Polish and the Soviets throughout, from 1939 on until the end of the war. I mean, the Germans, and frankly the Soviets too, I mean, they did, there was no quarter asked, no quarter given. It was nasty from day one, whereas against the French and the Brits and the Dutch and the Americans, and even the Italians to some point, it was not like that. It was not that bad.
I think that's one of the things that's really educational about this film. We can talk about it, I guess, toward the end, about things we thought were problematic about it. But I think it's very educational for Americans to see a film where the focus is on Poland. And it's not Western Europe or the U.S., and you can see the incredible brutality and the sort of full effects of the racial ideology of the Nazis there in the film. I mean, and I think it was alluded to about it is both random and yet it's consistent. I mean, to use Sarah's terms, I mean, I think for a lot of Americans, it's easy to be kind of insulated from that. And whereas in this film, especially when you see those incredible shots that Polanski has of Warsaw as just this city of rubble, it's a mountain range of rubble, of just ruins.
Yeah, those closing shots are spectacular. And I've actually seen photos of the city immediately in the aftermath of the war. And I don't know how Polanski did it, but he brought them to life. I mean, he really did it.
It's a city of the dead. It's some apocalyptic kind of landscape that you're looking at. And I think that really strikes home kind of what Seth was just pointing out about. This is a different kind of war that the Nazi regime is waging in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, I mean, if you look on the Western Front, you talk about destruction of a city, not a town, but a city. There really aren't any. Rotterdam was bombed to smithereens to a point in 1940, but I mean, when you talk about cities being destroyed, they're in Germany. Yeah, and they're being destroyed by us, by the Allies. They don't. I'm not saying that they withheld that type of violence. It just didn't happen on the Western Front as it did look at Kiev and Kharkov and the Soviet Union. They were much like Warsaw, just nothing left. Ground
I actually
into a
think
powder.
of Hiroshima and Nagasaki when I think of what Warsaw looks like at the end. Only it wasn't done with a single overwhelming. It was done layer after layer
block
after
by
layer,
block,
year after year, block by block. I mean, it's really, really horrible.
So, when you think of Holocaust films, or films about the Holocaust, I should say is a more appropriate term, three come to mind. This, Schindler's List, which in my opinion is the classic. That's the masterpiece. And Life is Beautiful, which is not even in the same category, in my opinion. That is a steaming pile. But how does this compare with other similar Holocaust films? In your opinion, Jason, I'll start with you. We'll go around the horn here.
Yeah, I couldn't help but think about this film in relation to Schindler's List. I mean, obviously, we've done a podcast on that, and that also deals with the case of Polish Jews. And that film is, especially after watching The Pianist now and reading Szpilman's memoir, that Polanski himself, I mean, he's connected to the liquidation of the Krakow Ghetto, and his mother perished in Auschwitz-Birkenau. And so I think that those two films really connect. They're, I guess, about 8 or 9 years apart, and I think did a lot to expose American audiences to what happened in Eastern Europe. I'm just going to interject things about my own sort of background here. I think about when I was first learning about the Nazi genocide in grade school, it was Anne Frank. That was the classic introduction to the story. And one thing about that story, of course, is that Anne Frank, her name is Anne Frank It's a lot easier for Americans to pronounce the name and to relate to her. She's a German Jew who was hiding in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, whereas in the case of Schindler's List and The Pianist, the names are harder for us to pronounce. The stories are less familiar to us, and I think that's what's really important about the film. It's not as familiar to us, and yet it's a central part of the history of the Nazi genocide. I mean, the death camps are in Poland. That's where they're at. 90% of Polish Jews are murdered, during the Holocaust. And those two films, for all their problems, and I'm not here just trying to be a cheerleader for Spielberg and Polanski, but those two films, I think, did a lot to help change the orientation a bit for Americans about what they knew about the Holocaust.
Jim, what do you think?
It's funny because I think I come from a very different experience where growing up in Queens, New York, I was surrounded by Holocaust survivors. And they are, at the time when I'm a child, they're in their early 40s. So this is something that I feel like I grew up with, have always heard about. It was always sort of in the back of my mind that this is the thing that happens to Jewish people, that you are born, and by virtue of being born, there are people who want you dead. And so seeing, both this film, thinking about Schindler's List, it was always part of my sort of collective memory as a child that it didn't seem like I was watching anything new or innovative. It felt almost like twisting the knife in a wound, like an inherited wound that I didn't necessarily know how to heal. It was always kind of getting opened back up. So I almost felt like movies like this were not necessarily for people like me. They were for other people who hadn't grown up with that perspective, who hadn't, had that lineage. Because I can't count how many times I've seen, a dead Jewish body fall off a stretcher or a wagon or some of these things, because I've never been able to escape those images. And so, when I compare these movies, to me, it almost comes from the same place of I recognize the importance, but it's also I've seen it so many times. I almost wish that there was something else that I could have as that Jewish experience, and I never will. That's been taken away from us, and that's sort of the lens I always look through. Life is beautiful. I don't even need to comment. It's just a complete outlier. It's just totally different from the experience and what it really was. That it's not even relevant to me.
And as I said, steaming pile.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Sarah.
I guess for me it's a little bit different. I grew up not in New York City, but in Western New York. And my parents are both ex-New Yorkers. But my father was he's in his 90s now. He was a Japanese historian who came to that during World War II in the cryptology and cryptography program. But he was also the only child born here of immigrants from Eastern Europe. And so I always was given the long view, which is that this is just a small part of Jewish history. Jewish history is rich and it's big and it has these peaks and these valleys. But you know what? Ancient Egypt isn't here. We are. The Nazis aren't here. We are. I mean, so I both got a belly full of what this was, but there was a much more kind of positive part to it growing up. So that didn't faze me. The movie that I keep thinking about, and I did a review of it for something else, which is more recent, is Son of Saul, which gives you, with Geza Rohrig, and it gives you this kind of moment-by-moment sense of somebody, a Sonderkommando member, working in the gas chambers and adjacent to the crematoria at Auschwitz. And I kept turning that over in my mind, and Polanski's, The Pianist, and I find that I like The Pianist better. I find that The Pianist gives me more of a larger sense of the Holocaust experience, and also of some of the positivity that obviously you're not going to get that, from a Sonderkommando in Auschwitz. But you get more of a sense of what I guess in response to Jem I would call the long game. And that way also the coda where you see Szpilman has survived at the end and he goes on with his life. And that also gave me that kind of positive sense of this. And I mean, it's a positive sense over the bodies of 6 million dead Jews and, millions and millions of others. But it gets me back to where I started around my family table when I was 5 or 6, which is that the Jews survived. We're still here. And so something of that I draw from The Pianist, I think.
It almost goes back to resistance. Like the very act of being alive in the face of all of this is an act of resistance, because it's the one thing they don't want you to do, and you've done it.
We talked about this, Jason, you and I did, and when we were talking about Schindler's List, and you'd brought up that Schindler's List almost requires you to have a previous knowledge of the Holocaust, or at the very least of something that happened in World War II, you know. Whereas this movie, I think, as opposed to Schindler's List, and don't get me wrong, I think, as I said, it's a masterpiece, but this kind of gives you that knowledge that you probably don't necessarily have. Because again, as I said, it starts off with the beginning of actually just before the beginning of the war, and goes all the way through. So while it doesn't talk about the Nuremberg laws, and it doesn't talk about, the different legal things or illegal things that happened to the Jewish populations of Europe, it does give you a pretty good step by step, at least for this man, or at least for these people in the Warsaw area, that Schindler's List doesn't, and that other Holocaust movies don't, because it's really, really difficult to cover, really, if you want to be 1934, and even before, if you really want to get technical, all the way to the end of the war. It's very difficult to do that. And this movie does that, and it does it pretty good, I think. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that given how complex that history is, and how difficult, extreme, maybe that's the right word, history, that you're dealing with there, it does pack it in. I mean, I think if I have any problem with that, is that the Szpilman memoir has amazing material about the German invasion. And it's spread out over 2 or 3 chapters. And that really conveys the fear when the Germans invade, and also the hopes that are temporarily raised about British and French intervention. You get a little bit of that in the film, but I understand too, Polanski's like, okay, I'm making a film that's already 2.5 hours long, and so he's going to focus on the period really from ghettoization forward. But the book also has some really remarkable material about his family and what it was like to be in Warsaw in the fall of 1939.
We've mentioned his name about 50 times in the movie, Roman Polanski. He's not exactly the most popular director in the history of Hollywood, so we really can't talk about this film without talking about him. How do you think his history plays out in how we interpret this film?
I started counting the number of women who were shot versus men or killed, because I started to notice a number where there were extraordinary number of men that are being depicted, their murders are being depicted, but there seemed to be more women. And it started to make me, wonder what kind of underlying misogyny there was, or if he was even aware of it, or if it was just happenstance or coincidence. And the fact that I had to even question it just shows, that how the things we know about the filmmakers really impact the way that we view the film. You can't separate when he's making a movie that is so clearly about something that is very personal to him as a survivor and the child of survivors. Like, you can't separate his personal experiences and the things that he may have done and the crimes he may have committed, because it just felt like it started to. I couldn't do it. I couldn't separate it when I was watching it, and there was always something. Every time a woman came on screen, I started to pay attention a little bit more about what they were saying and how they were treated, and sort of how their death may have occurred, which I don't think I would have done with another filmmaker, honestly. This is my question to you. Did it affect the way you liked or disliked this movie? I don't think I could ever like a movie like this in that sense anyway. Well, yeah, so it was sort of, I don't know if I even thought about it in that way, because I never set out to enjoy it or think of it as anything other than, is this accurate? Is this a good depiction? But it definitely clouded my ability to do that, because the lens through which it's coming from and the creative mind it's coming from is always going to be impacted by that's who they are. That's who any filmmaker is. And so, especially when you're talking about a topic this personal, I think it definitely impacted my ability to at least watch it unbiased in a way that I could have maybe another film if we had done that. What about you, Sarah? What's your opinion?
It's a little odd for me because honestly, I'm a historian, and so my kind of métier is documents, it's books, it's photo, but I started in the 19th century for my historical studies, and so it's not film. So I mean, I was well aware of Polanski's background in this, but for me to watch a film is always to deliberately suspend my disbelief. I have to consciously, before I even turn the film on, do that. So I don't think it really affected me so much that way. But after the fact, I went back and I kind of read about Polanski, and then I started turning the film over in my mind in light of that. It still doesn't particularly trouble me, but I absolutely agree with Gemma that what this film is a composite of who Polanski was and is, from his survivor background to whether he's done what he's accused of or not. The fact remains that this has been a big part of his adult life from the 70s onward. Multiple accusations have been leveled against him, and so that has got to have affected a film that he made in 2002. I mean, there's no question in my mind about that. Having said that, I still think Brody was spectacular in this.
Wait, we're going to get to that.
Oh, sorry. But I would definitely watch the film. I had not watched it before. You can call me a bad Holocaust historian, but and I really enjoyed it while I watched it, but I thought it was a little slow moving. In the days after I watched it, I found myself coming back to it repeatedly. Little visual snippets of things would pop up in my mind, and that to me is the mark of a really well done film. That I keep kind of going back to it. So,
Jason, what about you?
This film is, I think it's from here on, and I'm sure it was in 2002. I just don't remember enough of the discussions surrounding it when it came out, but I think anytime you're going to show The Pianist to a group, let's say you want a group of students to learn about Szpilman's story and show the film, you're going to have to talk about Polanski himself in a way that you would not necessarily do so with other directors, just because his personal background does inform it. He himself survived. He made it. He had family who were murdered and others who did survive, and yet his own personal background, the accusations, the charges of statutory rape, those are going to always come in, and they're going to be part of any discussion of not only this film, I think, but his work in general.
Yeah, I mean, the guy's not a saint by any means, and I personally don't really care for the movies that he's made, with the exception, and I'm giving it away, of this one.
Rosemary's Baby, I finally watched a few years ago. That
Chinatown.
It rattled me,
yeah.
I'll just say.
I'm not a huge fan, but I can see where his experiences, and I'm not talking about his post-war experiences, I'm talking about his wartime experiences, certainly influenced this movie. And, I mean, all right, fine, I'll give it away. I like this movie. I think it was really well done, and I think there are lots of it, lot of parts of it that are accurate. And we talked about the visuals, the scenes in Warsaw, and you can look at pictures, archival images, and the movie and go, wow. The guy really put in his work doing this.
There was one thing I was thinking about, Seth, when earlier you said he doesn't talk about Nuremberg, he doesn't cover it, and it immediately the vision popped in my head where he meets Dorota, this Polish woman that he's kind of interested in before he's in the ghetto, and there's a sign on a coffee shop, and it says in Polish, Jews not welcome, and that immediately that's what I meant about. He managed somehow to put in everything's at the kitchen sink.
A lot of detail.
A
lot of detail. You brought it up, so we're going to talk about Adrien Brody. he was honored with the Academy Award for Best Actor for this film. What are your thoughts on his performance? And we'll go around the horn again, but I'll start with you, Sarah.
Well, the smooching of Halle Berry aside, because I remember that too. It really was a bravura performance. I don't know that he'll ever match it again. No offense to him, but it was one of these kind of once in a lifetime performances where frequently without even saying a word, you're looking at his face, you're looking at his body language, you're looking at his eyes, and if there was an actor that was meant for this, for Roman Polanski to be able to do visually what Roman Polanski needs to do, he was the actor. There's just no question in my mind that there wasn't somebody else for this role.
I think the collaboration with Polanski is pretty amazing, and you see him go through the physical transformation, all the years of hiding and just searching for food at every place and the like. I say that, however, I'm just not a big Adrien Brody fan. So on the one hand, I think the film is terrific, and I think that it really conveys something that's powerful. But at the end of the day, I'm just not a big fan of Adrien Brody, and I kind of wonder where has he been for the last we haven't seen that much out of him.
Living off the royalties of this movie. Gemma, what about you?
I think it's one of the times when I look back at an Academy Award winner and I think that was the right choice. You know, a lot of the time we look back 10, 20 years later and we think what were they thinking? What was the Academy thinking? I think that one still holds up and makes sense. You know, the physical transformation, but also like the amount that he conveys without ever speaking. I mean, the longer the movie goes on, the less he speaks. Sometimes he's speaking through the music and he's still, envisioning Chopin in his head. Sometimes he's just, reacting to what others are doing. And to convey that much emotion and that much turmoil without even saying a word, I think that's really difficult. I couldn't do that. And so, I look back and I think, okay, yeah, that was a deserved accolade that he got. Like, that made sense. As for what he's doing now, I have absolutely no idea either.
I have to agree with Jason. I'm not a fan of him as an actor, but I think he absolutely deserved the award for this film. I mean, he was spectacular in this movie from beginning to end. He really was. And you mentioned it too, Sarah, when you watch a flick and then 2-3 days later scenes pop up in your head, or you start thinking about something that you heard or you saw in the movie or whatever it may be. And that's the sign of a good, powerful film. It is. I mean, I'm not going to sit there and go watch Dumb and Dumber, which I did the other day, by the way, and think too much on it unless I'm trying to crack a joke. But I mean, this is the kind of movie, among others, that certain things pop up in your head, and certain scenes in which he's in 99.9% of the scenes, but certain things that he does in the movie that stick in your mind, and that's a sign of an excellent performance in a really good film. So with that, Gemma, I'm going to start with you. Did you like the movie, and would you recommend it?
I thought it was a well-done movie, and I would recommend it.
I would agree. I think it's a terrific movie, even though, I mean, it's like and we talked about Schindler's List. I mean, this film's 2.5 hours long, so I mean, it's got a lot in there, but I think it's well done. And I would say if you like the film, then go read Szpilman's memoir, which is even better.
Sarah?
I would recommend it. I always think in terms of would I put it in front of a class full of college students who don't know that much about the Holocaust. And I think it does such a good job of kind of giving you the ebb and flow of what happens in Poland without focusing exclusively on the death camps. And then I haven't seen him in anything else, I have to be honest. But his performance in this was riveting, and I could see it really holding people's attention. So yeah, I would recommend it.
I agree with everybody here. I did like it, and I would recommend it. And I have to say, even though it is, as you said, 2.5 hours long, and Schindler's List is longer than that, I think this movie has a better flow than Schindler's List. It just does. It just moves faster, which is again a sign of a good storytelling. Frankly, despite my feelings for the man himself, not Adrien Brody, but Roman Polanski, I would recommend this movie because, as I said earlier, it does give you a pretty, granted, a 10,000-foot view of Warsaw's suffering and the Holocaust. So, and with that, I mean, there aren't too many films that do that and do it well and do it accurately. So, yeah, I would definitely recommend it. Gemma, final thoughts? Can you sum it up?
Sum it up? I always look at everything, because I'm a trained educator and that's my background. I look at everything through the perspective of, would this be a good teaching tool, not just for college students, but, specifically for K-12? Is this something that all audiences can relate to and find something in? And I think despite any flaws that the movie has or anything like that, I think it's definitely something that, regardless of the background you're coming from or how old you are, there's something that you can find to relate to and empathize with in this film.
I think one of the things we haven't really touched on, of course, is or said a lot about is the role of music. I mean, in this film, about the music of Chopin first and foremost, and that you see a figure like Szpilman who loved the music of Chopin, and that was a form of opposition. Chopin's music comes out of the period when they're rising up in Poland against Russian control in 1830, and so there's a real connection, I think, for him to 1939, 1945, German occupation. And so it makes me think a lot about art and resistance, the role of music in keeping alive memories against a regime like the Nazis that are trying to completely extirpate a people and everything about them. And I think that is also one of the things that's really valuable about the film.
There's some irony of him playing Chopin for the German officer. So, What about you, Sarah?
Like Gemma, I kind of view things through the lens of who I am, and I'm an historian. And what I found fascinating about this is he's both completely exceptional. I mean, he's Jewish. He's playing for Polish radio. Interwar Poland is a tremendously anti-Semitic place, and he's known to be Jewish. He lives through the Holocaust not because he's heroic, not because he's special, not because of but because of luck of the draw. He finishes the Holocaust, survives, and then he lives out his life doing what he had started doing, which is, as a known pianist and a composer in Poland at a time when the vast majority of Polish Jews have been murdered, and the remaining ones who can walk, crawl, get out of Poland, and he stays. He's on some level, he's a Polish patriot in the middle of all of this. So he again is a fascinating figure, and the movie kind of had me thinking about all of these somewhat aberrational characteristics that he had, and it made it that much more interesting to me as I was kind of thinking about it after I saw it.
I think, as I said, I liked it, and I think it is a good educational tool. I'm not an educator. I'm a historian, but I'm sitting here with two educators and two other historians. You wear several hats. But this movie teaches you something, I mean, again, this is a story that most Americans don't know or didn't know before they saw this, and it covers a lot of ground, and you leave having learned something, I think, and I think if a film can do that, it does a good job. So with that, I want to thank you so much for listening. Tune in next week for our mini-sode when we share oral histories from those who were there. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Be sure to rate and review us on Stitcher and iTunes if you like what you hear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer, Tessa Jager, and Music Shed Studios here in New Orleans. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.